Let's take a look at how to find a least common denominator or build a least common denominator. I often compare these to building a bicycle. We're going to look at all the different parts that our denominators have and put them together to make the perfect bicycle or the perfect least common denominator. So I've got a few steps to follow along the side. So let's take a look at these two fractions. Now we're not actually going to add them together in this video. We're just going to talk about how to find the least common denominator. Your first step, not surprising considering what we've been doing lately, is to factor all your denominators. If you can. In this case, nothing can be factored, or I guess we could say it's already been factored. It's 5 times x squared and then 15 times x. So that first step is done. There's nothing to factor in this case. The next step is something you've done before. Find the least common denominator of the coefficients. The numbers in front of your in your denominators specifically. We don't care about anything in the numerator for this. So 5 and 15. In other words, pretend you're back in middle school or elementary school and you're trying to add the fractions 1/5 and 1/15 together. I mean, that's basically what we will be doing. And so the common denominator you're going to need for that, the numerical part of your least common denominator, this perfect bicycle we're trying to build, is going to be 15. Now, you may find that a few different ways. Some people, hopefully many of you, just know between 5 and 15, 15 is going to be your least common denominator. You may have some other tricks you've used in the past to find a least common multiple or a least common denominator. One thing that you could do if you need to is list out multiples. For example, multiples of 5 are 5, 10, 15, 20, and so on. And then multiples of 15 are 15, 30, 45, and so on. And again, you're looking for the smallest number they both have in common, and in that list, there's that 15 that they both have. So 15 is the numerical part of our least common denominator. And again, you've done stuff like that before. The new part of this, our algebraic part, is finding the variable part of your least common denominator. To do this, you're going to take every single different variable piece you see, whether they're x's or in a second we're going to take a look at another problem that has, I call them chunks with parentheses. We're going to take a look at every different variable piece you see, and you're going to need to take every piece you see to build that perfect bicycle or that denominator. And if both parts have the same variable, you need to take the one that has the highest exponent. So in this case, the variable pieces are x squared and an x. Since they both have an x, I need to take the highest one, the highest power, and in that case it's x squared. So for this particular example, my least common denominator is going to be 15x squared. And that's all I'm going to do for right now. In our next series of videos, we'll take a look at how to actually add these together using that least common denominator. But for now, let's take a look at a couple more examples. Feel free to skip ahead if you don't need to see these other examples. But if you do want to see them, let's take a look at 2 more ways we're going to build our least common denominator, that perfect bicycle, that perfect denominator we're going to be looking for. This time we have 3 fractions we want to take a look at to find their least common denominator. It doesn't matter if we have 2 fractions or 3 or 10, the process is still the same. First step, once again, is to factor. Before you try to build your least common denominator, you need to make sure all your denominators are factored. The first and third are already done. We can add some times signs in there, 2 times x, and then this x minus 2 is this chunk I had been talking about. That can't be separated, so don't try to take the x and the negative 2 apart. That is one single entity, one piece there. This final one is also factored already, 3 times x plus 2, but this piece in the middle can be factored. Hopefully by this point you're really good at factoring and you recognize the difference of 2 squares. That's x plus 2 and x minus 2. If not, go back and watch some videos about factoring to review that. Alright, so step 1 is done. Everything has been factored. Step 2 is let's actually start to build our least common denominator, and let's do that first by looking at coefficients. So any numbers we have in front, in this case it's a 2 and a 3. I don't care about these numbers, they're not coefficients, so just look at numbers in front. Between 2 and a 3, the least common multiple, or the least common denominator, if you were trying to add 1/2 and 1/3 together, is 6. And again, hopefully, many of you hopefully just know that. Some of you can make your list of multiples, but 6 is going to be the numerical part of my least common denominator. And then finally, we're going to use the new part, finding the variable part of our LCD. To do this, I need to take every single different piece that I see and the highest power if any of them have higher powers. So taking a look at what variable pieces I see an x. This one has an x as well, and because they're both just to the first power, I don't need both of them, I just need to take one of them. So I'm going to need x. That's another part of my LCD, another piece of the bicycle I'm trying to build. X minus 2 is another piece. Now some people think set that x, we already have it. But remember, you can't separate that x. It's glued together. X minus 2 is the piece that I need. So let's include that as part of my LCD. And once again, even though there's two x minus 2's, neither of them are to a higher power, so I don't need to take both of them, just take one of them. Finally, I also see this part. I'm going to need that x plus 2 piece, so I'm going to actually have 4 parts to my least common denominator this time. I'll need the 6, the x minus 2, and the x plus 2. All of those are going to be my LCD. Again, in the next series of videos, we'll take a look at how to actually use that to add these fractions together. And let's just look at one more example, although nothing different here. If you've got the hang of it, that's great. You may want to try this one on your own. Pause the video and try it. Otherwise, I'll talk you through one more example. Again, first step, do not try to build your LCD until you've factored first. That is very, very important. So in this case, both denominators can be factored. I want to begin by looking, before I do any difference of two squares or trinomials, I want to always look for a greatest common factor. This one has a 4 that both terms have in common, so I'm going to divide out a 4 and be left with this. However, I can factor again because what's left in parentheses is another difference of two squares. And again, if you need help with factoring, I've got a bunch of videos about factoring you can go back and watch. So this has now been factored completely. I'll need those pieces to put together to build my least common denominator. The trinomial in the second fraction looks like it might require the box method because there's a 6 in front. However, I've noticed that all of these are divisible by 6. Once again, I have a GCF, a greatest common factor. So I'm going to pull that 6 out and be left with x squared minus 24x. And then plus 24. Again, though, I can factor a second time. I can factor that trinomial. Two numbers that multiply to positive 4 but add up to negative 4 are going to be negative 2 and negative 2. However, this time, rather than writing x minus 2 times x minus 2, I'm actually going to write x minus 2 squared. And some of you that are really getting the hang of this building the LCD thing probably know why I wrote that to the second power. Okay. Now that it's been factored completely, now I can start to build my least common denominator. So begin with the numerical part of it, any coefficients that you have. Between a 4 and a 6, the smallest multiple that 4 and 6 have in common is 12. Again, you can make a list of factors or a list of multiples, excuse me, or you have your own method, hopefully, at this point to find that. Pretend you're adding 1/4 and 1/6 together and think, well, what would I need that denominator to be? And it's a 12. Okay. Next up, build the variable part of your LCD. Take every variable piece you see and the highest power of that piece you see. And so there's an x plus 2. I'll need that piece. That's part of the bike that I'm trying to build, or part of the least common denominator. And then they also have this x minus 2 piece. However, one of them has a higher power, and when you're doing this, you need to take the highest of the powers. So I'm going to take x minus 2 squared. That's why I wrote it down squared instead of just writing x minus 2 times x minus 2. So there's a lot of examples, a lot of information to take a look at of how to build that least common denominator. Hopefully that's helped you. So that's the end of this video. Our next series is going to take a look at now what do we do once we've found this LCD to actually add these fractions together.